The story goes like this. It was the early 1600s, the time of pirates and scurvy. A young king, Gustavus Adolphus, sat on the Swedish throne, even as his cousin Sigismund, the king of Poland, claimed that he was the rightful heir. And around about 1625, Sweden's king caught word that his cousin in Poland was building this huge ship, one with 2 rows of gun ports rather than the traditional one. And Gustavus wasn't about to be shown up. Look at all those cannons. It's like Pirates of the Caribbean. The ship that Gustavus commissioned in return was called the Vasa, and it stands today in Sweden, a tower of timber and ornamental wood carvings extending over 200 feet long. The museum itself is also enormous, built to house and preserve the massive ship.
It's supposed to be like a stable climate, moisture, and otherwise the wood will...
It's a fitting tribute to a king who would come to preside over Sweden's era of great power, even if he didn't really like to admit that the country might have been a little expansionist.
If you listen to the king, it was not aggressive. It was a matter of fear all the time. So you need buffer zones.
Yeah.
Of course, that's an argument of an aggressor.
That's Patrick Höglund, the historian and marine archaeologist who agreed to show us around the museum. Patrick also curates Stockholm's Museum of Wrecks, and as he talks, it's obvious how much he loves this job, which is seriously very cool. It kind of makes me wonder why I didn't decide to be a marine archaeologist.
When we were swimming there, it's a big lion looking at you, like, oh! So you realize, oh, shit, they left the sculptures.
Patrick is bursting with energy as he tells us the Vasa's story, which remains today as a reminder not just of Sweden's warring past, but of the dangers of hubris.
Vasa was the first in a series of big ships, really big ships, at the time. In the late 1600s, this was like the standard size of a warship. But in the 1620s, it was really big. If this had sailed, it would have, beaten almost any ship.
But it didn't sail. Because on a sunny day with a bit of a breeze in 1628, the Vasa set out on its maiden voyage, and immediately, everything went wrong.
Vattnet vräkte in genom de öppna kanonportarna.
There's a mountain ridge in the southern part of Sweden, and then it's a valley. It came a gust of wind, heeled over one, heeled over twice, and then sank.
That little gust of wind caught the sails, the ship tipped, the gun ports filled with water, and it was gone. It sank to the seafloor well within sight of everyone on shore who had gathered to watch it depart on its first journey, including the reportedly livid King Gustavus Adolphus.
And some 30 people died. Probably around 150 were on board.
The ship just wasn't designed properly to hold all those cannons the king insisted on. And that resulted in one giant fail. But despite the expensive and tragic failure of the Vasa, Sweden became a major exporter of ships and weaponry.
In the late 1600s, a lot of the iron guns used on ship came from Sweden. On Dutch ships, on English ships, on French ships, they came from Sweden. You can still find them on wrecks. Like South Africa, so like Swedish guns on the ship.
This is a role that it still plays today.
Sweden would sell 4 Swedish-made Gripen jets that would expand Budapest's fleet of Swedish-built fighter jets.
Even as the rest of the Vasa story has been rewritten.
When I was a kid, it was very talk about peace. Peace. If you have a warship in a museum, you don't want to present it as a warship. Sweden was very mixed emotions about this great power era, wars, warship. No, it's not. We're a peaceful nation. But now, the last 2 years, it has actually switched.
Suddenly, this era of great power, it served to shed light on a history that Sweden has long buried, but one that never really disappeared. So, can a peace-loving nation with a war-loving legacy keep the peace when someone starts a war in their backyard? And how does feminist foreign policy really play out when defense is center stage? I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
What if millions of Black Americans had been compensated for slavery? Join me, Tremaine Lee, as I explore the untold story of one of the only Black Americans who ever was. I talk to his descendants and discuss how reparations forever changed their family's trajectory and imagine a reality where reparations are paid to the rest of Black America. Into America presents Uncounted Millions, The Power of Reparations, a Black History Month series. New episodes drop Thursdays. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Sweden is to join NATO after 200 years of neutrality.
Sweden becomes the second Nordic nation in the past year to join NATO.
And the 32nd member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
It took 2 years after holdups from Turkey and Hungary, but Sweden has officially joined NATO. It was also about 2 years ago that Sweden elected a right-wing government and discarded its feminist foreign policy. So it would seem like these two are connected. But Sweden's accession to NATO actually started with the government that introduced feminist foreign policy. That's Margot Wallström's party, the Social Democrats.
People interpreted the Social Democrats' decision to support NATO membership as an electoral strategy move, that they will remove this issue of possible NATO membership from the election debates because the conservatives could have tried to make it a central issue.
This is Dr. Brian Palmer. He's a professor at Uppsala University, and he was our gracious guide during our time in Sweden. He sat down with us in Uppsala to help unpack this story.
Some people saw that as a brilliant move by the Social Democrats. Now they will win easily. It didn't turn out that way.
They lost, but the accession to NATO continued. It's a transition that might have been helped along in public opinion by the leadership at the time.
The Prime Minister of Sweden was a woman. The Prime Minister of Finland was a woman. Neither of these women who were Prime Minister gave off an aura of needless aggression and machismo. In fact, quite the contrary. They seemed remarkably calm and level-headed and the kind of person you would want to have around in a crisis.
Fast forward 2 years, and along with the new administration, Brian says that overall, Sweden seems to have moved toward a growing sense of machismo, and that its distrust in outsiders and fear of attack in some cases seems to be purposely cultivated.
One cold day in December, I was on the way to my office in Uppsala, and the route takes me by the main library of Uppsala University. And I could see already from a distance there was a shipping container, as if from the back of a truck. And as I got closer, I saw that there was a sign, a large sign next to the container in Swedish that translated, "What happens in the meeting between a student room and a hand grenade?"
It was an interactive exhibit from the Swedish Defense Forces, and it was designed to get students thinking about the potential for war on the home front.
And we went into this not quite pitch dark space, and there was a very large screen, flashes that seemed to indicate bombs exploding, and for me it was like a strobe light in an old-style disco, rather annoying, and extremely high volume of sound, of explosions, of artillery fire, and there were also smells that I guess were pumped into the air or just put in the air by some means, of burnt material, as if you've ever visited the apartment of someone after there's been a fire and they're trying to salvage any unharmed belongings. It was exactly that kind of smell. And this went on for maybe a couple of minutes, quite unpleasant, some louder sounds of explosions at the end, and then things quieted down a bit, and on the screen I could see a student room in ruins, the furniture busted up, and everything on the floor in a random mess. And then the young woman in her soldier's uniform said, "We could go out now. What did you think of this exhibition?" I was honest that I thought it was rather annoying that I had to cover my ears because of the decibel levels at parts, and that I thought that a Russian invasion of Sweden was the least of our worries. But had she thought about the risk that the war in Ukraine, particularly if the NATO side has maximalist goals of humiliating Russia and taking back every square kilometer of stolen territory, could provoke a nuclear war, which would be easily the death of everyone in Sweden through the war itself or the resulting nuclear winter. And she admitted that she had not thought about such things and didn't actually know what nuclear winter was. So there we were with two very different visions of the biggest risks that Sweden was facing: a land invasion by Russia or a nuclear war that would be a catastrophe for Swedes and just about everyone else on the planet.
The truth is that Sweden has never been entirely neutral. In fact, it's one of the largest arms exporters per capita in the world. And when feminists tried to leverage those arms deals to advance human rights, it didn't go great.
It was Margot Wallström who dared to criticize the human rights record of the Saudi Arabian government, and not least the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia while she was foreign minister.
Saudi Arabia has recalled its ambassador from Stockholm after Sweden ended a decade-old arms deal with Riyadh.
Saudi Arabia replied that they would change their mind about certain lucrative contracts where they were going to be exporting Swedish weapons. The conservative government doesn't want any more situations like that and would rather just keep quiet about human rights or speak in platitudes that no one can really disagree with.
But even Margot's feminist foreign policy was, in some ways, a weak barrier in the march toward a military mindset in Sweden. That's after the break.
Are you worried about Russia invading Sweden?
Yes.
Are you? Yes?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you worry about it a lot?
Not so.
Not that much?
No.
Hey. Hi. If you're worried about Russia.
Yes. Yeah, Russia is going on.
In the end, Sweden decided to join NATO because of Russia. So we wanted to know how worried Swedish people really were about a Russian invasion. But the only folks we found who were that concerned were this group of teenagers from Ukraine. That said, it's a little late to go back now. So Dr. Anik Wibben, she helped us begin to unpack what this decision might mean for a feminist foreign policy. Is a feminist foreign policy compatible with NATO membership? It's a question for Sweden.
Yes. Well, I mean, Sweden does no longer have a feminist foreign policy. Yes, so in that sense, I guess we're off the hook.
Anik is a professor for gender, peace, and security at the Swedish Defense University.
On the other hand, Germany, for example, has been a member of NATO for a long time and has a feminist foreign policy. And if we want to go there, has been reacting also because the other big conflict that's going on right now, or that's in the news, of course, is the sort of full-scale invasion. Shall we just use the same terminology of Gaza?
Last September, Germany's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, remarked that Russia's horrific war was, quote, above all, affecting women, the elderly, and children, and explained that these impacts fell under the rights component of Germany's feminist foreign policy. She added that we need to call on those who infringe upon and violate rights to account. Fast forward to the war in Palestine, and Baerbock and Germany have both been criticized for their inconsistent response.
As Greens and feminists, we must demand a ceasefire in Palestine right now.
I will address this difficult question.
And so then the reactions have been quite different. How do we compare this? Shouldn't there be some consistency in foreign policy if a population is being attacked by a much stronger neighbor? Isn't this kind of the same? And then we can talk about NATO and we can talk about sort of internal NATO politics. Some NATO members are not even close to having some sort of feminist foreign policy or human rights respecting policy internally, externally. So, yeah, Is it in general compatible? It could be, potentially, right? But I don't actually think it currently is.
Some folks have argued that NATO's women, peace, and security agenda should be an indication that the alliance is actually compatible with a feminist foreign policy. But Onyx says that assumption depends a whole lot on the country and the policy that you're talking about.
So I think that what we see is like the interpretations, multiple, of the women, peace, and security agenda, multiple, and of feminist foreign policies, again, multiple. So then we get this sort of broader mix of things. And at some level, we can say, yes, they're all broadly in the same direction. But then we really have to look much more specific at what they do. So, for example, the interpretation of women, peace, and security that is propagated by NATO, right? But it's also a sort of question of like, are you applying it internally into the armed forces? Are you using gender-sensitive approach when you're going into the field? And on all of those things, there is some progress, if you want to call it that. But on the other hand, on a much more sort of what I might call critical feminist reading, or, you know, sort of the cherry picking which of the parts of the agenda you take on, it hasn't been that great.
Feminist foreign policy covers a lot of ground, which can make it hard to measure its success. And the finer details of implementation, they're mostly not spelled out. So it can be easy for any one country to interpret the policy loosely.
So one of the things that we know about the women, peace, and security agenda is that the protection pillar, that one is usually quite strong, right? We're going to protect women from violence and But the prevention pillar, which is really the most important, because, I mean, it's after the fact, it's a kind of usually a little too late. But what are we doing to actually prevent conflict, prevent sort of the impact that we know, the gendered impact that we already know is happening in conflicts? That pillar has been, not just in NATO, but more generally been the weakest, I would say, in the women, peace, and security agenda.
And with regard to Sweden's feminist foreign policy, was it particularly strong on the security agenda?
Yeah, Sweden is an interesting case because we have a real bifurcation in terms of the strategic cultures, I would say, of the foreign ministry, foreign policy approach versus the defense. So one of the things that's interesting about Sweden is that at the same time that the former Swedish government introduced feminist foreign policy, there was also an increase in funding for the armed forces.
Sweden's overall defense budget has been growing steadily since 2015, which is when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. And this year, the country added 700 million additional crowns, nearly doubling its defense budget since 2020.
So there has been a remilitarization at the same time. And now we still have the remilitarization, and we don't have the feminist foreign policy anymore. So one could say that the sort of more traditional security thinking has, quote unquote, won. I mean, the interesting thing is that those two strands of or strategic thinking, really, never shall they meet.
Okay, I have to ask about Sweden joining NATO.
Yes.
Margot Wallström told us that when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and Finland announced that it would join, it changed everything. And so she also changed her mind about NATO.
Because that set our whole security policy and us in a completely new reality. I believe that we can continue to discuss also the role of nuclear weapons, for example. I will insist on that. I know that it's difficult, but we will have to do that.
Margot says that Sweden can determine what kind of NATO member it will become, and that including more women in NATO decision-making will naturally influence the alliance's priorities and outcomes. Is it a necessary element of feminist foreign policy that the military be, I don't want to say devalued, that's too strong a word, but placed in some sort of more equal measure with the other elements?
No, but this is again a matter of how you construct this and how you cut it. Because if you think about women's rights, you start with making sure that women can be part of decision making also, that women are there to decide on the priorities. And of course, very often women have somewhat different priorities and maybe less militaristic than men. But it is not a given model, other than that women and men should enjoy the same opportunities and rights, and they have a right to be part of the decision making and form and shape their societies. And some women, of course, they accept that there has to be a defense, or they want a bigger defense industry or whatever, but women must be there where the decisions are being made.
This take feels a little bit incomplete. Put women in the room and see what you get. But you can't predict someone's ideas or attitude based on their gender. And in many cases, the expectation that women will naturally promote peace, it just doesn't hold up. Centuries of male ownership over war-making have led to structural limitations and cultural assumptions that are near impossible for many women and men to overcome. Former Undersecretary of Defense in the U.S., Michelle Flournoy, she coined a term for this. She said that many women put on a consensual straitjacket when they enter national security. Basically, that they put on a hard or more hawkish exterior in order to be taken seriously. And this is perhaps the missing piece in Sweden's feminist foreign policy. See, Sweden has always used military strength to defend itself and its interests. But it also learned a long time ago that narrowing in on one perspective is dangerous. Before the disastrous failure of the Vasa, King Gustavus was actually warned that the ship was unstable. But he didn't listen. While it might seem like bringing more women into the room will automatically create a diversity of thought, that is not the whole story. Limiting the policy to gender actually makes it near impossible to analyze things like war and peace in a meaningful way. You end up with a policy that just puts more female generals and diplomats in place, for example, and doesn't ask whether the military is receiving too much money at the expense of the diplomatic corps. But having more feminists in the room, whether male or female, could add an additional perspective to Swedish decision-making, and perhaps even prevent a more traditional security mindset from making mistakes that cost lives. But then, Sweden isn't the only country with a feminist foreign policy, so we wondered if anyone else was doing it better. Anybody doing it really well? No, not yet. Maybe we'll get there.
There have been some moments, I would say, where it's been great. And then overall, it needs work. But what doesn't?
In our next episode, we look more closely at the work that feminist foreign policy needs in a very different country, Mexico. And we talk to some of the women fighting for change.
And it was really touching just exactly because to put a feminist symbol here, this feeling of justice, our own justice.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. And if you like what we do, you can find more at inkstickmedia.com. This episode was produced by Nikki Galtland and me, and edited by Amy Drozdowska. The music for our show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise is our engineer. A big thanks to everyone who welcomed us in Sweden, but especially to Dr. Brian Palmer, who went above and beyond in helping us to report these last 2 episodes. And thanks, as always, to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.
You can only do 2 dives per day because of decompression sickness and stuff.
Yeah. How deep is it?
A secret. Oh, you're a Russian spy. No, I say it's between 25 and 35.